He was expelled from his own country's dream, with no army, no water, no resources. So he cried on live TV. Then he built one of the richest nations on earth out of pure discipline and spite. This is the story of Singapore, and the man who refused to let its abandonment be its ending. Singapore's modern story starts in 1819 when the British East India Company, represented by Sir Stamford Raffles, set up a trading post on a small, swampy island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. Its location, right on the Strait of Malacca, made it one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world for global shipping. Traders, laborers, and migrants poured in from China, India, and across the Malay archipelago. For over a century, Singapore was a British colonial port. That changed brutally during World War II, when Japan occupied the island from 1942 to 1945, an occupation that shattered the illusion of British invincibility and lit the fuse for independence movements across the region. By 1959, Singapore had won self-governance from Britain. At just 35 years old, a Cambridge-trained lawyer named Lee Kuan Yew became its first prime minister, leading the People's Action Party, known from here on as the PAP, a party he'd co-founded 5 years earlier. Lee's vision, from the start, was merger. He believed a tiny island with no resources and no hinterland could not survive alone. So in 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, alongside Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak. It didn't last. Tensions erupted almost immediately. Malaysia's federal government was led by the United Malays National Organization, UMNO for short, a party that built its politics around policies favoring the ethnic Malay majority. Lee and the PAP pushed something different, a Malaysian Malaysia, where race wouldn't determine political privilege. That idea was a direct threat to the arrangement UMNO depended on. Then Lee made it worse, in Kuala Lumpur's eyes. The PAP contested seats in the 1964 Malaysian election, challenging UMNO on its own turf. That same year, racial tensions boiled over into deadly riots between Chinese and Malay communities in Singapore, hardening federal leaders' fears that Singapore's politics could destabilize the entire federation. By mid-1965, Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman had concluded there was no fixing it. On August 7, 1965, Singaporean and Malaysian leaders signed a separation agreement in secret. Lee made one last attempt, going to the Tunku directly to ask if the split was really necessary. The Tunku's answer was blunt. As long as Singapore remained connected to Malaysia, the two sides would keep struggling to be friends. On August 9, 1965, at a press conference at Broadcasting House, Lee Kuan Yew announced that Singapore was now an independent, sovereign nation. And then, on camera, in front of the world, he broke down. His voice cracked as he described a lifetime of believing in merger, in people bound by geography, economics, and kinship. He later called it a moment of anguish, saying he felt he had let down people across Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak, who had believed in the same union he did. Singapore hadn't chosen independence. Independence had been handed to it, as an expulsion. Here's what made Singapore's next chapter remarkable. Lee didn't stay in that moment of grief. Within hours, at that same press conference, he was already talking about the future, telling Singaporeans to be firm, to be calm, to build a multiracial nation, and to unite regardless of race, language, religion, or culture. The challenge in front of him was staggering. Singapore had no domestic market, no farmland, not even its own water supply. Most of it piped in from Malaysia under treaties that could, in theory, be threatened. Unemployment was high, housing was overcrowded and unsanitary. And Singapore now sat next to a much larger neighbor it had just publicly split from under strained terms. Lee's government responded with a strategy that broke from what most newly independent post-colonial nations were doing at the time. Instead of protecting domestic industry behind trade barriers, the common approach across the developing world in the 1960s, Singapore did the opposite. It courted multinational corporations aggressively through the newly formed Economic Development Board. the EDB, offering political stability, low corruption, and tax incentives in exchange for factories, jobs, and technology transfer. Malay remained the national language, but Lee pushed English as the working language of commerce and education, instantly wiring Singapore into global trade networks in a way few of its neighbors could match. Lee paid civil servants and ministers competitive market-benchmarked salaries, a deliberate move to remove the financial temptation for bribery, while building the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPIB, into a genuinely independent enforcement body with real teeth. The Housing and Development Board, the HDB, rehoused the population from slums and overcrowded shophouses into high-rise public flats, while enforcing ethnic quotas within housing blocks specifically to prevent racial enclaves from forming. Every worker contributed to a mandatory savings scheme, the Central Provident Fund, the CPF, covering housing, healthcare, and retirement, reducing the need for state welfare spending while funding national development. None of this came free of cost to civil liberties. Lee restricted press freedom, used defamation suits and internal security laws against political opponents, and allowed little space for organized opposition. He argued openly that Singapore's survival required discipline and stability that a freewheeling multi-party democracy might not deliver fast enough. The results were undeniable. Within a single generation, Singapore transformed from a struggling, resourceless port city into what economists would later call an economic miracle, one of the four Asian tigers, alongside Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. Lee Kuan Yew served as Prime Minister for just over 31 years, from June 5, 1959 until November 28, 1990, making him Singapore's longest-serving leader by a wide margin. But he didn't disappear from power when he stepped down. He became senior minister under his successor, Goh Chok Tong, from 1990 to 2004, a cabinet-level role that kept him deeply involved in major policy and foreign affairs decisions. Then, when his own son, Lee Hsien Loong, became prime minister in 2004, Lee Kuan Yew took the title Minister Mentor, a position he held until 2011. For over 2 decades after leaving the top job, he remained arguably the single most influential voice in Singaporean government, advising, shaping foreign policy, and lending his authority to his successors, even as he was no longer the one making day-to-day decisions. He only fully retired from cabinet in 2011, following a weaker-than-usual election result for the PAP that year. Lee Kuan Yew died on March 23, 2015, at the age of 91. By the time of his death, the country he'd once feared had no hope for peace had become one of the wealthiest nations on earth per capita, with among the lowest levels of public corruption anywhere in the world, regularly ranking in the global top 3, alongside Denmark and Finland. Countries from Rwanda to Vietnam to Kazakhstan have since studied the Singapore model, trying to replicate its blend of market-friendly economics, disciplined governance, and anti-corruption rigor. Few have matched it, because what Singapore built wasn't just policy, it was execution, discipline, and a leadership team that, however authoritarian, was also relentlessly committed to clean, competent government. An island that was expelled with nothing became a nation other governments now try to imitate. That's the story of Singapore. Abandonment turned into architecture, and grief turned into one of the most disciplined nation-building efforts in modern history. If stories like this, about resilience, discipline, and the systems that actually shape how nations and people thrive, speak to you, you'll find more of that thinking woven through everything we cover on this channel. Follow Healthy Eats and Wisdom for more.